Welcome back, everyone. So today, we're not only looking at a cold case that has recently been solved, but this case has a connection to another cold case that was recently solved. Both cases are out of Washington State here in the United States. In Washington State, for those who are around the world, is a state that is on the west coast, the Pacific coast of the United States. But this case also has twists, turns, and some very odd things that are part of it, some very odd people. And there's just no way around it. No bright, shiny, fun way to tell everyone about this case. So let's just jump into it. Make sure you stick around to the end because you're going to be surprised. And thank you for joining me today. That is why today's video is just me, you, and the camera. We're going to go back to 1972. And I want to tell you first off about a young man who was lost. He didn't seem to find a way in this world. And he never, as he grew older, in the next 50 years, never really seemed to find his way. Terrence Miller. Terrence Miller was a peculiar young man who would spend a lot of his time daydreaming and doing odd things that his family, looking back on in hindsight, said were destructive, worrisome, and even downright probably illegal. Terrence would spend most of his most developmental years as a teenager and young man daydreaming. For days on end, he would just go for walks, not in the forest and looking at flowers and trees, but he'd go walk along the freeway of all things for nothing else, just to see and hear the cars whistling by him at fast speeds. This is what he would admit to his family. Him just enjoying long walks on the shoulders of the freeway, not caring about anything. No destination, just walking along the freeway. When he wasn't walking along the freeway, Terrence enjoyed science fiction. Nothing wrong with enjoying science fiction, but Terrence went deeper into science fiction. And the lines between science fiction and reality were often blurred for Terrence. It was as if Terrence had fallen into the world, and if that world was safer and more of a world that he enjoyed being in than those around being in the world around him and with the people around him. Terrence had very few friends. He had one or two that were closer to him than anyone else. And as he grew into his young adulthood and into his early 20s, those friends drifted away. There was nothing, there was no one left on Terrence's side, no one for him to talk to daily. He had already shunned and pushed away most of the family members who were closest to him. But Terrence seemed, by everyone who accounted it later on and looked back on it, he seemed happy. There wasn't anything that was outwardly noticed that said, hey, we need to get this man some help. He wasn't depressed. He just was existing within his own time, in his own space, and inside of his own head. Terrence was just Terrence. Here, but not really wanting to be here. Wanting to be somewhere else. but never really telling people what was going on with him or what he was thinking. This is Terrence in 1972. The Terrence that later became the monster that he was completely different from that. It was as if somebody flipped a light switch and Terrence went from being the young, self minded young man that he was and caring, but lost in his own make believe world and his own world of science fiction and connected to friends and family. Terrence became a completely different man. In one heartbeat, Terrence had changed. Terrence had become somebody else, but nobody understood what was going on with Terrence. August 23rd, 1972. A young woman by the name of Jody Loomis woke up that morning and followed her routine like she normally did every single day. She got up, she cleaned up, she did her hair, got changed, got ready to go do and take care of the one thing in this world that made Jody Loomis happy. Jody went out, got on her bicycle, and started riding out to her horse stable because she wanted to go for a ride on her horse. It wasn't a far ride. Wasn't that it that she couldn't do it and hadn't done it thousands of times before. Jody enjoyed her horse. She loved spending time with animals. She was there for her animals and anybody else if they needed help with their horses. This is something that Jody did on a daily basis. Even if she wasn't going to go out for a ride that day, she'd just go out to the stables to help other people with their horses, feed them, clean their stalls, helping out, giving back. That is the Jody Loomis that everyone remembers. But Jody Loomis didn't make it to the stables that day. August 23rd, 1972. Jody never returned. She never returned to the stables, and she never returned home. It wasn't until later that day that Jody Loomis's body would be stumbled upon, partially nude, tossed into the side of a ditch. Her bicycle found about 100 yards from her body. Jody Loomis was attacked, raped, beaten, and strangled to death. The case and who did this to Jody went cold. It went cold for a lot of years. The police had no one. There was nobody within the community that was a prime suspect in this case. They searched high and low. They followed leads. They followed rumors. Psychics came in and gave them tips that said that this was the person, or they need to look here for more evidence. But nothing in the end panned out. In the case of who did this to Jody Loomis went cold. A tip came in. A tip that came in that opened the case, dusted off all the cobwebs of this case. But it wasn't a tip that led them to any one individual. It was a tip that somebody from the area was closely following this case. It was a tip that somebody was obsessed with not only this case, but other cold cases that have been recently solved in California, Washington, Chicago, and in other major metropolitan areas. This person was following cases that had to do with reverse genealogical lookup and Pardon laboratories. This person who was obsessed with these cases was none other than Terrence Miller. Terrence Miller had become obsessed to the point of almost being a stalker to the police departments that were solving these cases. His internet search history, the obsessive collecting of newspaper articles, and everything else about it. On a hunch, the police department said, we have a small budget that we can use for surveillance on this case. Terrence was known to travel to the Emerald Queen Casino on a weekly basis to play cards and to play the slot machines and other gambling devices that they had there at the Emerald Queen Casino. They followed Terrence to the casino one night and watched him. He discarded a coffee cup, a paper coffee cup, into the trash after finishing the cup of coffee before returning to the poker table. This cup was quickly grabbed, put into a bag, and sealed, and sent off to Washington State's crime lab. There, the Washington State Crime Lab compared the DNA that was left on the coffee cup rim to that of the spermatozoa that was collected from Miss Loomis, Jody Loomis's boot, along with the rape kit that they had collected in 1972. And it was a dead match. With that match, the police got an arrest warrant for Terrence Miller. And when they came to his home, he was working in the garage like he had done most days of the week. Because remember, Terrence didn't fit in society. Terrence was kind of a loner. And even then, 50 years later, Terrence was not somebody who would, show up at your Christmas party or to your home unexpectedly to ask you to borrow a screwdriver. Terrence was in his garage doing what he had done every single day. Ceramics. Yes. Terrence was living a comfortable, middle-class life. And, oddly enough, Terrence was married. Terrence was married at the time. When they came into the garage where Terrence was pouring a mold in his garage to be fired in his kiln, the police noticed over on a workbench area not one, but 3 scrapbooks and a newspaper that was out and folded to a reasonably cold case solved in Washington State. And that case was solved using reverse genealogical match and lookup. This was the case of a couple from British Columbia who were murdered in Washington State. Here at the top, I will put a link to that case, to a video that I've already done on this case. But Terrence didn't put up a fight, didn't make any outward, questions or say, hey, no, you got the wrong man. Nothing. Matter of fact, he reached across the table from where he was working as if to put his hands out so they could cuff him. Because Terrence knew his time was up. Terrence knew. They finally came to him, and they had the right man for who killed Miss Loomis. Terrence was charged with first-degree murder in this case. Not having any money for anything beyond a public defender. A public defender was issued in this case for Terrence. The initial first day in court, where he entered his plea of guilty or not guilty, went without any hiccups at all. Terrence pled not guilty. Was then issued a bail amount, where him and his wife, from their savings and retirement account, came up with the money to bail Terrence out. Terrence walked out that day on the condition that he was to stay away from anyone from the Loomis family. He was not to leave the area. He had to surrender his passport, and he needed to check in with the court system if he went anywhere within more than 75 miles from his home. He agreed to it all. They posted bail, and Terrence walked away. Terrence went right back to the home and went right back to work, doing what he was doing before the police came and arrested him. He went back to pouring more molds, firing more things in his kiln, and not really seemed to have changed anything in his life. The case went on. Terrence came to court. Witnesses took the stand. Damning witnesses took the stand. Pardon Laboratories took the stand. Washington State Crime Lab took the stand. And it didn't look good for Terrence at all, because every person who took the stand in this case, the picture was painted. This could only have been one person. One person. Terrence. Terrence Miller. The defense tried to put up a fight saying that the DNA was collected inappropriately, that it wasn't tested correctly, that the spermazoa from Mrs. Loomis's boot and rape kit were deteriorated to the point where it wasn't usable. But that's not true. Every procedure was followed to the exact point where it needed to be. It was secured properly. It was done properly. And it matched one person only, Terrence. It didn't match anyone else in the history of DNA out there. The reverse genealogical DNA plus the DNA directly from the rape kit and the spermazoa from the boot matched Terrence and only Terrence. There was only one possibility, and the jury would eventually find Terrence guilty. While the final days of the jury were there, and the jury members were looking at the evidence, the picture was very clear. To Terrence, I'm guilty. I'm going to prison for the rest of my life. They know he knew with inside of himself that he knew he was guilty of this crime. He wrote out a short letter to his wife and his family and friends and said nothing about the case at all, other than they're going to convict me of this crime. And I'm sorry for what I've done in the past. Terrence then took his own life 3 hours before the jury could come back with their answer, guilty on all counts. While the jury was deliberating in this case, they were not told anything of Terrence's actual suicide. They just decided, let him go. Let the jury decide for themselves first. Came back, unanimous, guilty, all counts. Not a single juror member, not an alternative member of the jury, thought that Terrence was innocent of this crime. Yes, immediately his defense attorney, the public defender, came out and said, well, if the DNA was collected inappropriately, we don't believe these results. But it doesn't matter, because 3 hours prior, the defendant took his own life. Terrence Miller. Why did he do it? No other brushes with the law. He never assaulted anyone, ever. He was a docile young man and as an adult, who kept to himself, who seemed to be just be daydreaming his life away. What turned Terrence violent that day? Was it a confrontation along the freeway where Terrence was walking like he had done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times before, just daydreaming as he walked along? And that one chance encounter along the roadway of him and Miss Loomis, and then one thing led to another. Terrence never did anything like this before or after. Family members of his wife said that Terrence was a well-minded, respected individual within their community and never acted out. And he was the last person they would ever think would commit any type of violent offense. But Terrence was guilty. There was no way around it. The police also never released the following information: a partial fingerprint from the handlebars and a partial fingerprint from the basket area on the back of the bicycle matched that to Mr. Terrence Miller. But Terrence didn't have a criminal history, so there was no match. They had nothing to match it to. This came out in the case. The guilt. The guilt of what he had done. This is why he was acting peculiar in 1972, August of 1972. But now, Terrence is gone. Miss Loomis is gone. But in the end, we know who the guilty party is. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. You have a great weekend.